Today, instead of focusing on the beatings that were heard about in the gospel, I'm going to focus on faith. That was the theme that ran through the first couple of readings. Now, when I first hear the word faith, the thing that comes to mind to me is, believing and accepting in something that we can't fully comprehend or something that we can't fully explain. For instance, it takes faith to believe and accept that the bread and wine become the body and blood, soul and divinity of Jesus, right? That is a core of our faith. We can't explain it necessarily. We can't understand it necessarily. And we don't have to. We just have faith and we believe it and we accept it. But in our second reading today, we hear a little bit different take on what faith is. In the letter to the Hebrews, we hear that faith is the realization of what is hoped for and evidence of things not seen. And then we hear about Abraham and his life and how that relates to what faith actually is. Now, if you think about Abraham, at the time of Abraham, God wasn't known to humanity, right? This was well after the flood, centuries after that. People didn't know anything about God. He wasn't present in their lives at all. Everyone was going around worshiping rocks and trees and fish and all kinds of other stuff. Nobody knew God. But in God's plan, he knew that at some point in time I was going to reintroduce myself to humanity, and my plan for salvation was going to take hold from this point on. And Abraham was this person that he chose. His name at that time was Abram. So this strange God approached Abram, who was, by all senses, a wealthy and successful person at that time. He had big flocks, he had a lot of possessions, he had servants, he had pretty much everything that you could hope for. I'm sure he was an upstanding person in his community. And then this strange God comes to him and says, you know what, Abram, I want you to pick up everything you have and go off somewhere that you've never been before, somewhere you've never seen, and I'm going to promise to give you this area. And he had the faith. He had faith in this unknown God. He figured that this God was trustworthy and that his promises were something that he could believe in. So he showed faith. And God gave him three things that he was going to deliver to Abraham. He said, I'm going to give you a promised land. So it was a very choice piece of land, something very sought after, something he didn't have as a nomad. So he's going to have a promised land. He was going to have descendants that were as numerous as the stars and uncountable like the sands on the seashore. Now, Abraham was like 75, 80 years old when this all started, and he had no children. So that was kind of it's one of those out there promises, just like the land. And then he also said, I'm going to give blessings to the entire world through you and through your descendants. So these were some pretty hefty promises that were given to Abraham. So something that'd be, okay, I'm going to pick up and do these things because this is a pretty worthwhile reward if I do it. So he had faith. He went out on this journey. He did what God asked. And as he was going into this land, we hear that he entered the land, but he didn't receive it as a possession. He lived as a foreigner in his own promised land. He lived in tents. It wasn't something that at that point on he was given that land. And his descendants, it wasn't until he was almost 100 years old when Isaac came. So how could he have descendants as numerous as the sands on the seashore when he had one son when he was 100? He was never going to see any of these other descendants of his. And he was never going to really see the land that he was told that he was going to inherit. And he was never going to see these blessings. I mean, he was blessed as a person and his family was blessed, but he was never going to see the blessings that would come out to the whole world through his descendants. At that point in time, we hear that he could have reconsidered. He could have lost faith in God's promise and said, you know what, I'm going to go back to where I was before because I had it pretty good there. But he kept his faith. He realized what God's promise was something more than the land that he was given or that he was promised. It was more than the descendants. It was more than the blessings. He came to realize what he was being promised was a heavenly inheritance, something that would last forever. So after he saw this life, he would inherit something even greater. And he kept faith that, you know what, that promise is even better than the promise of this land and the promise of these descendants and the promise of blessings. So he kept that faith, and he lived that faith knowing that God would provide this for him. And if you think about it, this is what God calls us to be. We are called to be just like Abraham. We're living our lives, and we're doing the things that we do, and sometimes God is foreign to our lives. And God calls us out, and he says, you know what, I want you to live a different life. I have these things that I'm promising to you that I want you to follow and live your life the way that I want you to, so that you can inherit these things, that you can be given promised lands, you can be given blessings. But it's going to call you out of the life that you have now, and you're going to have to do things a little bit differently. So he calls us all to have the same faith, right? And the faith is the same that Abraham had. We're not going to realize it when we're here. We're pilgrims. We're saying we're pilgrims on this earth. We're sojourners. We're just like Abraham. We're living this life in hopes and anticipation of the next life, of the promised life of heaven. That's the real promise. That's what we have to have our faith in. And just like Abraham, when he was living in the land, we see glimpses. In every Mass, we see a glimpse of heaven. We see a glimpse of the promise that we're given. During the liturgy of the Eucharist, when God himself is present, Jesus on the altar, we are in heaven. We are a part of heaven at that point in time. We are taking part in the feast of the Lamb of God. That's a small little taste of what heaven is. If you have the faith, the eyes of faith to see what's happening at that point, God gives us these little signs and symbols to give us faith, or to strengthen our faith, that we can realize what's coming. And it's difficult to keep this faith. It's difficult for us as Westerners, as Americans, to kind of put off our reward, right? We're all very, and I included, are focused on, if I want something, it should happen right now. I should be immediately gratified for the things that I want and for the things that I need. If somebody promises something to me, they better deliver it like right now, and I better be able to see it. Or it's easy to lose faith on that. We say, well, it's not going to happen, so we move on. So it's hard for us as a culture to put faith into something that we're not going to see in this life. And you think about the people in our culture, in this country, it used to be, even within my lifetime, I could always assume somebody was a Christian. I always grew up assuming everybody was a Christian. But you can't do that anymore. There's so many people that don't know Christ. They don't know God at all in their lives. They have never been introduced to him, or haven't experienced God, or had somebody tell them about God. So they go through life not even having this promise given to them. They don't have any faith at all. They don't have faith in God. So as humans, we're always looking for something to give us fulfillment, right? Something always to give us meaning. So as a person, we put our faith in things that will always come up empty. We put our faith in money. We put our faith in our possessions. We put our faith in our jobs. We put our faith in our standings in a community. We put our faith in other people. And we put our faith in ourselves. We say, I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to lift myself up and do this all on my own. We put our faith in the wrong places because we don't put our faith in God. And then all these things let us down. The things that we're trying to accomplish in this life, they let us down. They have to. They can't fulfill eternity. Our souls are eternal. They need to be fulfilled by something that's eternal, which is God. So it cannot be fulfilled by money or possessions or any of these things. So people go through life not being fulfilled. So then either they move on to the next thing that tries to fulfill them, or they double down on it. And this is, in my opinion, this is really a symptom of what's going on in our country and why things are such a mess. People are looking for fulfillment and not finding it. So it leads to addictions. It leads to distractions. It leads to things that drags them even farther away because they're trying to find that fulfillment. And then if somebody has a choice in life and somebody else comes around and says, you know what, that's not what God wants for you, they reject that. They want their life to be validated even though it's wrong or bad for them. And then they lash out. I think this is why our environment is so toxic. If you think about it in politics and just community, people are lashing out against people of faith that are saying, there's a better way. And they're like, I don't know that way. I don't want to know that way. They don't know how to react to it. So then we end up in this environment where we can't talk to each other, and there's violence. People don't know how to react. The shootings that we had again, it's just crazy. It's just, this world is unhinged because it doesn't know God. The faith is put in the wrong spot. So it's up to us as people that are baptized to bring faith back into the world. When God calls us to live our life in faith, to realize and not lose it ourselves that, everything that's going on in this world, the promises of God are trustworthy. I trust God, and no matter what's happening, good or bad in this world, I know that heaven, the heavenly kingdom, is the ultimate promise that he's given us. And Jesus told us the Father is pleased to give us his kingdom. He wants it for us. He just wants us to have the faith that we need to hold on to what's going on in this life and to live for the next life. And not only that, but to help those around us who haven't experienced God, to teach them who God is, to teach them what love is, and to teach them what your faith should really be put in. Not in ourselves, not in our things that we do, not in our distractions, but in God himself. So today when we receive communion, again, when we get that taste of heaven as we're sojourning and God gives us a little bit of taste of that reward, pray for the faith to endure. Pray for the faith to let the Eucharist strengthen your faith and send you out into the world to be a witness to what the alternative is. The alternative of hope. The alternative of telling people that, God is trustworthy. If you have faith, then you will inherit the kingdom that he promises.